I always thought working the late shift at the diner was a drag, but it paid the bills. That particular night, the rain came down in sheets, hammering the windows like they were trying to get in. I was alone, as usual. Betty, my colleague, had called in sick, and I had the place to myself. The neon sign outside flickered, casting eerie shadows across the empty booths. The night had started off like any other. The rain had kept most people indoors, so business was slow. I wiped down the counters and organized the condiments, trying to keep myself busy. The sound of the rain was oddly soothing, a constant backdrop to the hum of the fluorescent lights and the distant rumble of thunder. It was around 1 a.m. when the bell above the door jingled. A man walked in, soaking wet, his trench coat dripping water onto the linoleum floor. He was tall, with a gaunt face and hollow eyes. Something about him set my nerves on edge. He took a seat at the counter, and I walked over, trying to act casual. "What can I get you?" I asked, forcing a smile. He didn't respond immediately, just stared at me with those piercing eyes. Finally, he spoke. "Coffee, black." I poured him a cup and placed it in front of him. He wrapped his long fingers around the mug, but didn't drink. The silence stretched on, growing thicker with each passing second. I could feel his eyes on me, watching my every move. "Rough night out there, huh?" I ventured, trying to break the tension. He nodded slowly. "You could say that." I tried to engage him in small talk, but he only gave curt, one-word answers. Eventually, I gave up and retreated to the back kitchen, hoping he'd leave soon. When I returned, he was gone. Relief washed over me until I noticed the mug of coffee was still full, completely untouched. I shrugged it off and continued my duties. About an hour later, the doorbell jingled again. This time, it was a police officer. He looked grave. "Evening, officer. Can I help you?" I asked, trying to hide my surprise. He showed me a picture. "Have you seen this man tonight?" It was the same gaunt-faced stranger. "Yeah, he was here about an hour ago." "Why? What's up?" The officer's expression darkened. "He's a suspect in a series of murders. Escaped from the asylum 2 days ago. Dangerous. If you see him again, call us immediately." My blood ran cold. The man I'd served coffee to was a killer? I assured the officer I'd be on the lookout and watched him leave, locking the door behind him. The diner felt more oppressive than ever, the rain outside seeming to grow louder. As I turned to head back to the counter, I froze. There, on the floor by the counter stool where the man had sat, was a puddle of water. But it wasn't just water. It was mixed with something dark, something that looked disturbingly like blood. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. I picked up the phone to call the police when I heard it, a soft, menacing chuckle from the back kitchen. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned to face the kitchen door. It creaked open, and the gaunt-faced man stepped out, his eyes gleaming with a sinister light. In his hand was a large kitchen knife, stained with fresh blood. "You shouldn't have called the police," he said, his voice a low, menacing whisper. I stumbled back, knocking over a chair in my haste. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like lead. The man advanced, his steps slow and deliberate. Desperation gave me strength. I grabbed the nearest thing, a heavy frying pan, and swung it with all my might. The man dodged, but the pan connected with his arm, causing him to drop the knife. I didn't wait to see his reaction. I bolted for the door, fumbling with the lock. Just as I managed to wrench the door open, he grabbed my arm, his grip like a vice. I screamed and kicked, finally breaking free and running out into the rain. I didn't stop running until I reached the police station. I burst through the doors, drenched and out of breath. A couple of officers rushed over. "What's going on?" one of them asked. "He's at the diner. The man you were looking for. He tried to kill me," I gasped, barely able to form the words. The officers exchanged glances and quickly got into action. They escorted me to a waiting room and assured me they'd check it out. As I sat there, shivering and clutching a blanket they'd given me, I couldn't shake the image of those hollow eyes and the sinister smile. The minutes felt like hours as I waited for news. Finally, one of the officers returned. His face was a mix of concern and confusion. "We checked the diner," he said. "There was no sign of the man, but we did find the knife and the puddle of water you mentioned." My heart sank. "He must have escaped," I said, more to myself than to him. "We'll keep looking. In the meantime, it's best if you stay somewhere safe. Do you have anyone you can call?" I nodded, thinking of my sister who lived nearby. I called her, and she came to pick me up. As we drove through the rain-soaked streets, I couldn't stop looking out the window, half expecting to see the gaunt-faced man lurking in the shadows. I stayed with my sister for a few days, too terrified to go back to the diner. The police continued their search, but there were no further sightings of the man. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. The media picked up the story, dubbing him the Rainy Night Killer. I tried to move on, but the fear lingered. Every time it rained, I would hear that menacing chuckle in my mind, and I would see those hollow eyes. I started seeing a therapist to help with the anxiety and nightmares. The sessions helped, but the memory of that night never fully faded. A few months later, I got a call from the diner owner. He was sympathetic, but needed to know if I planned to return to work. Reluctantly, I agreed. I couldn't let fear control my life. On my first night back, the rain was falling again, just like that fateful night. The shift started quietly. I kept glancing at the door, my nerves on edge. Around midnight, the bell jingled. I looked up, expecting the worst, but it was just a couple looking for a late-night snack. I breathed a sigh of relief. As the night wore on, the usual regulars trickled in and out. By 2 a.m., the diner was empty again. I was wiping down the counter when I heard the bell jingle once more. I looked up, and my blood ran cold. The gaunt-faced man stood there, dripping wet, his eyes locked on mine. I froze, unable to move or speak. He took a seat at the counter, just like before. My mind raced, trying to think of what to do. The police had never caught him, and here he was, back to finish what he started. "Coffee. Black," he said, his voice sending chills down my spine. I nodded mechanically, pouring the coffee with trembling hands. I placed the mug in front of him, and he wrapped his fingers around it, but didn't drink. The silence was suffocating. "You thought you could get away," he said, his voice low and menacing. "But you can't escape me." I backed away slowly, my eyes darting to the phone on the counter. If I could just reach it and call for help. Before I could react, he lunged across the counter, grabbing my arm. I screamed, the sound echoing through the empty diner. I struggled, but his grip was like iron. He pulled me across the counter, his face inches from mine. Just when I thought it was the end, the diner door burst open. 2 police officers rushed in, guns drawn. They tackled the man to the ground, prying him off me. I stumbled back, gasping for breath, tears streaming down my face. One of the officers helped me to my feet, while the other handcuffed the man. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice gentle. I nodded, unable to speak. The man glared at me, his eyes filled with hatred. "This isn't over," he spat as they dragged him away. The officers stayed with me until my sister arrived. She hugged me tightly, her face pale with worry. "Thank God you're okay," she whispered. The police later told me that the man had been spotted near the diner earlier that evening, and they had been keeping an eye on the place. They were able to intervene just in time. Knowing he was finally behind bars brought some relief, but the trauma of that night stayed with me. I decided to leave the diner job for good. I moved in with my sister temporarily, needing the comfort of family. With time, therapy, and the support of loved ones, I began to heal. But the fear never completely went away. Even now, years later, whenever it rains, I can't help but look over my shoulder, half expecting to see those hollow eyes watching me. The memory of that night is a reminder of the fragility of safety and the lurking dangers in the shadows. I've learned to live with the fear, using it as a reminder to stay vigilant and to trust my instincts. The experience changed me, making me more cautious, but also stronger. I survived a nightmare, and that strength is something no one can take away from me. Working the night shift at a call center is mind-numbingly dull, especially when it's raining cats and dogs outside. That night, it was just me and a couple of other colleagues, spread out across the massive open office. I was at my desk, handling some paperwork, when I heard the phone ring. I picked it up. "Hello, this is Alex from customer service. How can I assist you?" Silence. I repeated my greeting, thinking it might be a bad connection. Then a voice whispered, barely audible over the rain, "Help me." Chills ran down my spine. Who is this? How can I help you? The voice was faint, almost drowned out by static. "I'm trapped. Please, you have to help me." I glanced around, but no one seemed to notice my discomfort. "Where are you? What's your name?" "Behind you," the voice whispered. I spun around, heart pounding, but there was nothing, just the empty, dimly lit office. I turned back to the phone, but the line was dead. Shaking it off as a prank, I tried to focus on my work, but the uneasy feeling lingered. A few minutes later, the phone rang again. I hesitated before picking up. "Hello, this is Alex." "He's coming for you," the voice said, clearer this time. My pulse quickened. "Who? Who's coming for me?" The line went dead again. I decided to tell my supervisor, Mark, about the calls. He was in his office at the far end of the building. As I walked through the rows of empty cubicles, the fluorescent lights flickered, casting ominous shadows. The rain pounded harder against the windows, creating an almost deafening roar. When I reached Mark's office, I found him hunched over his desk, working on some reports. I told him about the calls, expecting him to brush it off, but instead, his face grew serious. "Did they say anything else?" he asked. "Just that they're trapped and that someone's coming for me." Mark nodded slowly. "We've had reports of strange calls like that before. Usually, they stop after a while. Just ignore it." I returned to my desk, still feeling uneasy. The rain continued to lash against the windows, and the office felt eerily quiet. I tried to focus on my work, but my mind kept drifting back to the calls. Who was that woman? Was she really in danger, or was this some elaborate prank? I decided to take a break and get some fresh air. As I walked towards the exit, I passed by the security room. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see the monitors displaying different areas of the building. One of the screens caught my eye. It showed the basement, a place I had never ventured into. The image was grainy, but I could make out a figure standing in the middle of the room. It was the woman from the calls. She was looking directly at the camera, her eyes filled with fear. I felt a chill run down my spine. I needed to know more about her. I knocked on the door, and the security guard, Mike, looked up. "Hey Alex, what's up?" "Mike, can you rewind the footage on that monitor?" I asked, pointing to the basement camera. Mike raised an eyebrow but complied. As he rewound the tape, the figure of the woman flickered and then disappeared. "That's odd," he muttered. "There shouldn't be anyone down there. Can you check it out with me?" I asked, my curiosity piqued. Mike nodded and grabbed his flashlight. We made our way to the basement, the sound of our footsteps echoing through the empty halls. The stairwell leading down was dimly lit and felt colder with each step. The basement was a maze of old furniture, dusty filing cabinets, and forgotten office supplies. The air was damp and musty. We split up, each of us taking a different section to search. I walked through the narrow aisles, my flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional drip of water. As I turned a corner, I spotted something on the floor, a piece of torn fabric. It looked like part of a dress, similar to what the woman on the screen was wearing. I picked it up, my heart racing. What was she doing down here? And who was she running from? Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me. I spun around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. There was nothing there, but I could feel a presence, like someone was watching me. "Mike!" I called out, my voice echoing. "Over here," he replied from somewhere to my left. I followed his voice and found him standing in front of a locked door. "This is strange," he said, pointing to the door. "It's usually unlocked. Do you have the key?" I asked. Mike shook his head. "No, but I can call the building manager to get it." While we waited for the building manager, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The rain outside continued to pour, the sound almost deafening now. Finally, the manager arrived and unlocked the door. The room was small and windowless, filled with old furniture and boxes. In the center of the room was a single chair, and sitting on it was the woman from the calls. She looked up at us, her eyes wide with terror. "Please help me," she whispered. Mike and I exchanged a glance. "How did you get here?" Mike asked. "I don't know," she replied, her voice trembling. "One moment I was at home, and the next I was here. He's coming for me. You have to help me." "Who's coming for you?" I asked, my mind racing. Before she could answer, the lights flickered and went out. The room was plunged into darkness, and I felt a cold hand grip my arm. I tried to pull away, but the grip tightened. "Mike!" I shouted, but there was no response. I fumbled for my phone, using the flashlight to illuminate the room. The woman was gone, and Mike was lying on the floor, unconscious. Panic set in as I tried to wake him up. Mike groaned and slowly came to. "What happened?" he asked, rubbing his head. "I don't know," I replied, helping him to his feet. "But we need to get out of here." We stumbled out of the basement, making our way back to the main office. The rain was still pouring outside, and the building felt even more oppressive. As we reached the office, the phone on my desk rang again. I hesitated before picking it up. "Hello." "He's here," the woman's voice whispered. "Run." I dropped the phone and turned to Mike. "We need to call the police." Mike nodded and dialed 911. We explained the situation, and they promised to send someone over immediately. While we waited, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The police arrived within minutes, their presence a welcome relief. They searched the building but found no trace of the woman or anyone else. They took our statements and assured us they would investigate further. As the night wore on, I tried to focus on my work, but my mind kept drifting back to the woman. Who was she, and why was she in our building? And who was the person she was so afraid of? Around 4 a.m., the phone rang again. This time, I didn't hesitate. "Hello." "He's inside," the woman's voice whispered. I froze, my eyes scanning the office. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and I heard a noise behind me. I turned to see a shadowy figure standing at the far end of the room. "Mike!" I shouted, but he was nowhere to be seen. The figure started to move towards me, slowly at first, then faster. I grabbed my phone and ran, weaving through the cubicles. My heart was pounding in my chest as I reached the exit and burst out into the pouring rain. I ran to my car and locked the doors, calling the police again. They arrived quickly and searched the building again, but found no one. I was starting to feel like I was losing my mind. The next day, I decided to take a break from work. I couldn't shake the feeling of unease, and the memory of the woman's voice haunted me. I spent the day at home, trying to relax, but my mind kept drifting back to the events of the night before. That evening, I received a call from the police. They had reviewed the security footage and found something disturbing. In the footage, they saw me and Mike entering the basement, but there was no sign of the woman. It was as if she had never been there. I couldn't believe it. I knew what I had seen and heard. The police assured me they would continue to investigate, but they had no leads. A few days later, I returned to work. I couldn't let fear control my life. The office felt different, though. The rain had finally stopped, and the sun was shining, but the memory of that night lingered. I tried to focus on my work, but my mind kept drifting back to the woman. Who was she, and why was she in our building? And who was the person she was so afraid of? As the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak and shadow made me jump. Around midnight, the phone rang again. I hesitated before picking it up. "Hello. Thank you," the woman's voice whispered. "You saved me." Before I could respond, the line went dead. I sat there, staring at the phone, trying to make sense of what had happened. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The police continued to investigate, but they found no leads. The woman and her mysterious pursuer remained a mystery. I started to see a therapist to help me deal with the trauma. The memory of that night haunted me, and I needed to find a way to move on. Slowly, I began to heal, but the fear never completely went away. Even now, years later, whenever it rains, I can't help but look over my shoulder, half expecting to see those hollow eyes watching me. The memory of that night is a reminder of the fragility of safety and the lurking dangers in the shadows. I've learned to live with the fear, using it as a reminder to stay vigilant and to trust my instincts. The experience changed me, making me more cautious, but also stronger. I survived a nightmare, and that strength is something no one can take away from me. It was a typical rainy night, and I was the last one in the office, as usual. I worked in a small law firm, handling the late-night paperwork that piled up during the day. The rain drummed against the windows, and the only light came from my desk lamp. The rest of the office was shrouded in darkness. The night had started off like any other. The rain had kept most people indoors, so business was slow. I wiped down the counters and organized the condiments, trying to keep myself busy. The sound of the rain was oddly soothing, a constant backdrop to the hum of the fluorescent lights and the distant rumble of thunder. As the night wore on, I felt the oppressive silence of the empty office building. The occasional creak or groan of the old structure made me jump. The rain outside seemed to intensify, and the distant rumble of thunder grew louder. I was deep into a particularly tedious contract when I heard a noise. It was faint, barely audible over the rain, but it sounded like a soft sobbing. I paused, listening carefully. There it was again, coming from the far end of the office. I stood up, my heart beginning to race. "Hello," I called out, but there was no response. Grabbing my phone, I used the flashlight to navigate through the maze of cubicles. The sobbing grew louder as I approached the storage room. I hesitated, my hand on the doorknob. Gathering my courage, I pushed the door open. Inside, huddled in the corner, was a woman I didn't recognize. She looked up, her eyes wide with fear. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" I asked, keeping my distance. "Please help me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He's coming for me." Before I could ask who she meant, the lights flickered, and the room plunged into darkness. I turned, trying to find the source of the problem, but when I looked back, the woman was gone. Panic set in. I rushed out of the storage room, my mind racing. Was I hallucinating? I ran to my desk to call security, but my phone was dead. The rain outside seemed to grow louder, pounding against the windows like an ominous drumbeat. As I frantically searched for a way to contact someone, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to see a shadowy figure standing at the far end of the office. My blood ran cold. The figure started to move towards me, slowly at first, then faster. I didn't wait to see who it was. I ran, weaving through the cubicles, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps behind me grew louder, closer. I burst into the break room, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands shook as I tried to block the door with a chair. The footsteps stopped outside the door, and I held my breath, praying they would go away. Suddenly, the door burst open, and I stumbled back, falling to the floor. The figure stood in the doorway, illuminated by the dim light from the hallway. It was a man, his face twisted with rage. "You shouldn't be here," he growled, advancing towards me. I scrambled to my feet, looking for anything I could use as a weapon. I grabbed a glass bottle from the counter and smashed it against the table, brandishing the jagged edge. "Stay back!" I shouted, my voice shaking. The man hesitated, then lunged at me. I swung the bottle, catching him across the arm. He yelped in pain, clutching his wound. Taking advantage of his distraction, I ran out of the break room, heading for the exit. I burst out of the office building into the pouring rain, not stopping until I reached my car. I locked the doors and called the police, my hands still trembling. They arrived within minutes, but when they searched the office, they found no trace of the man or the mysterious woman. The police were baffled, but they assured me they would investigate. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even as I drove home. That night, I barely slept, haunted by the events of the evening. The next day, I handed in my resignation. I couldn't go back to that office, not after what happened. I never found out who the man was or why he was after me. The woman's identity remained a mystery, and the police never uncovered any leads. Weeks passed, and I tried to move on with my life. I found a new job, one that didn't require me to work late nights. But the memory of that night haunted me. Every time it rained, I felt a chill run down my spine. One evening, I received a call from a detective working on the case. He had found something interesting in the office building's history. Apparently, years ago, there had been a series of murders in the building. The victims were all women who had been working late at night. The detective believed that the man who attacked me might be connected to those murders. He asked if I remembered any details about the man's appearance. I described him as best I could, but my memory was hazy. Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, I began to do my own research. I spent hours in the library, poring over old newspapers and police reports. The more I learned, the more convinced I became that the building was haunted by the spirits of the victims. One name kept coming up in my research: David Miller. He had been a security guard at the building during the time of the murders. He was a prime suspect, but there was never enough evidence to convict him. He disappeared shortly after the last murder. I couldn't shake the feeling that David Miller was the man who attacked me. But why had he come back? And why was he after me? I decided to visit the office building one last time. I needed closure, and I hoped to find some answers. The rain was pouring down, just like that night. As I walked through the empty halls, I felt a sense of déjà vu. I made my way to the break room, the place where I had first encountered the man. The room was dark, and the only sound was the rain pounding against the windows. I stood there, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me. I turned to see a shadowy figure standing in the doorway. My heart raced as I recognized the man from that night. "You shouldn't have come back," he growled, his voice filled with anger. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice trembling. "Why are you doing this?" "I am David Miller," he replied, stepping closer, "and I have unfinished business." I backed away, looking for something to defend myself with. David Miller advanced towards me, his eyes filled with madness. "You and all the others," he said, his voice a menacing whisper. "You think you can just forget about me? About what I did?" "I don't know what you're talking about," I replied, my mind racing. "Why are you doing this?" "Because they need to remember," he said, his voice filled with rage. "They need to know that I am still here." I grabbed a chair and swung it at him, but he easily deflected it. He lunged at me, and we both fell to the floor. I struggled to get free, but he was too strong. Just as I thought it was over, the door burst open, and the police stormed in. They tackled David Miller to the ground and handcuffed him. I lay on the floor, gasping for breath, my mind reeling from the ordeal. David Miller was taken into custody, and the police finally had the evidence they needed to connect him to the murders. The spirits of the victims could finally rest in peace. I moved on with my life, but the memory of that night stayed with me. I had faced my fears and survived. The rain no longer brought me fear, but a sense of strength. I had faced the darkness and come out the other side. Years later, I still think about that night. The office building was eventually demolished, and a new one was built in its place. The spirits of the victims were finally at peace, and the memory of David Miller faded into history. I continued to work, but I never forgot the lessons I learned. I became more vigilant, more aware of my surroundings. I knew that the darkness could strike at any moment, but I was ready for it. I had faced my fears and survived, and I knew that I could face anything that came my way. The rain, once a symbol of fear, was now a reminder of my strength and resilience. I had faced the darkness and emerged victorious, and that was something no one could take away from me.